just going to open the floor, I guess, to people to ask questions.
Could she reveal any of those tweets?
Oh, yes, I want.
Oh. Yeah, I couldn't do it justice. So, I really couldn't do it justice. But the worst of the sort of attacks came from the United Kingdom at the in an informal session, and one of the things that they said that really fired us up was, I'm sure you're all aware of the phrase "do no harm," part of the physician's oath. And we have a lot of physicians that work on nuclear weapons. There's, IPPNW's the biggest group of physicians that works on this issue. And so they often use that phrase, "do no harm," as a reason for eliminating nuclear weapons. And the UK decided to turn that around on us and use it in relation to the ban treaty, and to say that we would do harm by negotiating a treaty banning nuclear weapons. And so we needed to adhere to the principle of do no harm. There's a lot of other funny things that have been said that are actually on the record from the U.S. and the U.K. and Russia in terms of the devastation that will follow the negotiation of a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapon. It will basically end the world as we know it. It could even lead to a nuclear war because it will destabilize international relations to the point where countries will just end up using their nuclear weapons, which I like the victim blaming nature of that one, that if you try and take away our weapons, we're going to use them on you, is a little, extreme. This is at the UN in General Assembly meetings over the last few years. These are the kinds of things we've heard. So not compelling arguments against negotiating this treaty. But also, it's been very indicative to us that we're on the right track, because it wouldn't elicit such absurd responses if it wasn't really provoking them, when they would just ignore us. But they've changed from ignoring to raging against us in belligerent ways, and having many secret meetings and issuing directives to their allies. So we know we're on the right track. We know this will affect their policies and positions and make their lives more difficult. So we're happy about that.
Filling the legal gap. Would it possibly make illegal the selling to the United States or Russia or any of the other nuclear armed states some material that could be used in the making of a nuclear weapon, like a cylinder or something? Right,
exactly. Yes, it should. I mean, we can't say what will be in the treaty. Unfortunately, ICANN doesn't get to negotiate the treaty. But that's one of the things that we'll be advocating for is absolutely a prohibition against the transfer of nuclear materials or equipment to non-state parties. So if the U.S., etc., don't join on, then they shouldn't be able to receive materials that would be used in producing a nuclear weapon.
And so the follow-up to that is, do non-nuclear states provide important material, not I guess uranium is one, but also some of the technology and even maybe providing scientists or maybe providing some of the cylinders or whatever. Do you have any, or is there a way to find out how much non-nuclear states provide nuclear states in building their or maintaining their nuclear force?
Yeah, some of that information is available, and of course already there are safeguards around the transfer of material or equipment, preventing them from going towards nuclear weapons. So a lot of that does exist, say through IAEA safeguards, International Atomic Energy Agency. So there's already rules and regulations and restrictions, but this would be another opportunity to codify that. In terms of materials, uranium is a big one. So for example, if Canada and Australia did sign on to this treaty, then what would that mean in terms of their provision of materials to countries that might have nuclear weapon programs? So that'll be a big question for them, I'm sure, and something that they wouldn't necessarily want to have to deal with. But yeah, that'll be an issue.
Yes, of the countries that signed on
Mhm.
in last October, how many new countries have signed on? And what about countries that abstain or have the decency to abstain from among the nine nuclear partners? None of them signed on or abstained. What
Right.
did they do?
So it wasn't a sign-on, so there haven't been any new countries since then. So it was a vote that was taken, so it was a one-off vote. 123 voted to begin the negotiations. Some countries did abstain. So of the nuclear armed states, China and India abstained. North Korea voted yes to the treaty. But India and China, they were the only two that abstained. And so that's why we think that they might come to the negotiations. We're not sure since most NATO countries, other than the Netherlands, voted no, and Japan, Australia, and South Korea also voted no. It's a bit interesting if they do show up at the negotiations, because of course, if you vote no on a resolution, you're signaling that you don't think the treaty should happen. So how do you come to negotiations and participate in good faith if you said you don't want this treaty to happen? But we've tried to encourage them to come anyway, and have done lobbying back in capitals to try and get them there. So we're not sure who will come from them.
The U.S. and I guess some of the others are using that argument that of destabilizing, like, our national security depends on our having these weapons, which are actually a deterrent to war, and that if we get rid of the nuclear weapons, there'll be a lot more conventional war. What's the argument you guys use against that?
So we argue against deterrence all the time. That it's one of these things that is impossible to prove and impossible to disprove, of course, because throughout history there have been a number of opportunities or near misses or accidents, etc. Or the nuclear weapons weren't used because of one person refusing to do their job, for example. So deterrence doesn't really hold up to that. Deterrence doesn't also really hold up to the wars that we have seen, all the proxy wars that have happened all over the world between allies of the US and Russia. It doesn't hold up when it comes to, say, the Vietnam War as well, and the war in Korea. So to me, I think there's enough instances in history that we can say deterrence isn't a real thing. But then, of course, if you believe in deterrence, you can also say, well, there hasn't been a great world war the same way that we saw in the 20th century, so therefore deterrence does work. So you can argue back and forth those things until you're blue in the face. I believe one aspect of that. But I think that the overarching premise that having an extremely destructive weapon, investing billions of dollars in making them more usable, and persisting in extremely discriminatory policies that permit only a few countries to possess them, whilst demonizing anyone else who might think of getting them. I think all that undermines your premise that you're trying to prevent war or violence. Developing, investing in, possessing, and sort of upholding the value of the most destructive, violent technology in the world can't be the way that we avoid more violence. It just can't be. And the catastrophic consequences of the use of even a single nuclear weapon would be so devastating. And the risk of that happening, I mean, it's basically a miracle that it hasn't happened. And the risk of that happening just grows as time goes on. It doesn't diminish. It's sort of an empty argument, nuclear deterrence, and I think it's a morally bankrupt argument as well. I think if you want to prevent war, there are many other ways that we've grown since World War II in terms of international solidarity, human rights, etc. Those are what we should be continuing to pursue and develop, not destructive weapons. For the Prohibition Treaty, that's one of the great things about it, is we don't actually need an intrusive or comprehensive verification system, because at this point, this treaty isn't about the actual technical, physical elimination. So if nuclear armed states want to join on to the ban treaty later, or are compelled through this sort of normative and stigmatizing effects of the treaty, and the economic effects of the treaty, if they're compelled to agree to disarmament, which is what we want, that's our ultimate goal, then we're going to need verification provisions for sure for the actual dismantlement of nuclear weapons, particularly in terms of making sure that that is irreversible and transparent. But there's a lot of work going on that already. The United Kingdom and Norway for several years have been running a project looking at how a non-nuclear armed country can help verify disarmament of a nuclear armed country without any of the sort of technical secrets being passed to the non-armed country. So that project has been going on for years. We get reports from it. It seems like it's going well. Technically feasible, completely technically feasible. We have the International Panel on Fissile Materials, which is run out of Princeton University. They've been doing a number of exercises and studies on how to verify nuclear disarmament. These questions about the transfers of nuclear materials, safety of nuclear materials after disarmament, all of it is technically feasible, and the expertise is there. We just need the countries to agree to disarm, and then we can basically go. So we're ready.
You know, if depleted uranium is going to be one of the aspects of the treaty ban, that's one question. The other is very, very political in a New York sense. For the meetings that are coming up in March, would Mayor de Blasio be invited to any of the sort of formal greeting, opening, whatever?
No, he hasn't been. Typically, the meetings at the UN are government in terms of countries. So it's not very often that we have local politicians from any country engaged in the proceedings. Sometimes members of parliament from countries will come, so congresspeople would come, but that's very rare, and they don't deliver formal interventions on behalf of their countries usually, unless they're mandated to do so by the government in power.
So would Donald Trump, therefore?
Well, he could if he wanted to, but the United States isn't going to come to these negotiations. They're going to boycott them, so he won't be there. I suppose if there is an event, certainly in the city, if Mayor de Blasio wanted to support banning nuclear weapons, is New York at the march? That would be a great opportunity to engage him. Is New York or any part of the state a non-nuclear weapon free zone? Because San Francisco is, right? Or something, or the Bay Area?
They've Mayors for Peace around New York State, but we worked very hard on New York City and haven't gotten Mayor de Blasio to sign on.
Well, maybe that's an opportunity then around these ban negotiations to double down on those efforts, getting him to join and that kind of thing. But yeah, getting him to the march and rally could be great. Okay, and depleted uranium, that was your other question. So no, that won't be covered in this treaty, because this treaty is only dealing with nuclear weapons. So we're just going to prohibit nuclear weapons with this treaty. So depleted uranium is another horrible thing that needs to be dealt with, absolutely, but not in this instrument. This instrument's just about the nuclear bomb. But
Munitions are weapons.
Right, but we're talking about nuclear explosive devices, so fission or fusion bomb. That has a nuclear chain reaction to explode. Depleted uranium munitions are not that at all. They are derivative of course, the nuclear weapon production, fuel chain, etc. But they're very different from a nuclear weapon.
How has the people you associated with coped with the more or less well-known statement recently by Trump as he was introduced to the nuclear world? What's the point of having them if you don't use them?
Yeah, well, I'd say that's a pretty good reason to ban them.
Has there been any educational outreach?
Yeah, there has been a little bit. I think certainly we've tried to follow up with the media on that and get our message out. But it's always hard to get traction in the media. So, but we have tried to use that as an opportunity for sure.
Along that line, beyond diplomacy and in the realm of truth, is there discussion among the professional thinkers on this subject around the world that as opposed to America feeling great again like it used to, that there is kind of a urgency, necessity for the American people to wake up that the greatness of the past was built upon criminal activity by the United States, wrongful, and that the waking up isn't too much to hope for. There have been books like the one that Osama bin Laden urged Americans read, Rogue State by William Bloom. And another is Killing Hope, which is documented really throughout by U.S. government statements. So do you have some thought along those lines?
Well, I can't speak for any of my colleagues or anyone else that I work with on the nuclear weapons issue on that at all. But I do think that there's a lot of different opinions and perspectives on that. I think that it's useful to think about our history, the history of this country, history of my country also, which is not immune from bad practices in the past. But I think that's a little bit removed from what we're talking about here tonight.
I'll grant you that.
So,
Couple, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there was a little disagreement within the nuclear disarmament community about the ban treaty, versus doing some another approach, with a conference or a new, using the MPT to widen and push the nuclear armed states. Has everybody, in your opinion, come together to support this initiative in the nuclear disarmament community, all the different groups who've tried different approaches, that they're going to all, get behind this ban treaty and
get on
work
the
really hard?
bandwagon?
Yes.
Wah, wah. Mostly, I would say. There's been, there was a lot of other approaches. There has been, of course, over the years, a number of approaches to deal with this problem. And some groups didn't feel that this was a comprehensive enough approach because it isn't an elimination treaty. But of course, we've been pushing for that for 70 years. So the idea was, what can we do if we're no closer to getting the elimination of nuclear weapons through a treaty negotiated by the nuclear armed states? In fact, we're further away from it than we've ever been in terms of investments and build-up and that sort of thing. Over the course of the success that we've had in getting this treaty agreed to, we've seen most groups now willing to support it because it is happening, and that's undeniable. A lot of those groups were still not in favor of it up until the point it was adopted, basically at the General Assembly. But now that it's on the table, they're mostly supporting it. But there's still a few that are grumbling, and I hope that everyone comes along and is constructive. And we have this is a great opportunity, I think, for us. The other great thing in terms of growing support for this initiative is that when the treaty was adopted, we've been talking to a lot of the major sort of human rights and environmental groups around the world to get them interested in nuclear weapons. When the resolution was adopted in October, we had statements coming out from Oxfam, Greenpeace, and Amnesty International all supporting it. So that was really great. I hope that they're going to be engaged this year while we negotiate, because they have big, powerful networks, obviously, and connections to a lot of people around the world working on a lot of issues. So that would be really great. It's one of the things when we started this a few years ago, some of the governments that we were working with that were supportive of this, but hesitant to move on it, really wanted us to bring them mass mobilization and then they would do the treaty. And we told them, nuh-uh, you got to get us a treaty on the table and then we can mobilize people, because until then we have nothing for people to hook onto. Now that we have a treaty, or the negotiations are on the table and about to begin, we can mobilize people around that. And that's the way things went. And then exactly, we needed this moment to have groups like Amnesty and Greenpeace excited about it.
You know, April 24th, there's a big climate march in D.C. I think, do I have the right day? 29th, April 29th, sorry. Which probably will be really big. I wonder if there are different groups could think about how we could use that event to pull people in for the New York mobilization in June.
Yeah, that would
Maybe
be
like,
really
you know, people spaced out enough that there'd
Yeah.
be time to maybe make that more like the climate march idea of bringing lots of
Yeah,
different, not make it narrow, but make it wide.
absolutely.
Sally, who was working on the climate, the Peace and Planet climate thing that was a couple of years ago? Was Joseph and Jackie and you guys?
The Peace and Planet?
The climate.
Oh, well, the climate march in New York
Yeah.
City? I mean, that was environmental groups mainly, but they had convergences.
350.
350.org, I think Avaz was involved, and they, you know, they had a lot of money.
Yeah.
And, you know, from larger organizations, and they did sort of convergences around different, you know, students, around environment, around peace, and
Yeah, but then in the NPT meetings in 2015.
yeah,
so
Peace and Planet
that
has
was the
is
piece
another.
that was, you know,
Yeah.
linking the
Yes.
environment and.
Yeah, I
It wasn't
remember that
specifically
one. It was
nuclear, it was
huge.
the war.
That was 2014 was the
Yeah,
climate
that was
march.
huge, right?
2015 was the Peace and Planet, which there were about
NPT.
7,000 for the NPT. So there were some real efforts made to cross, you know, and bring all of these silos together and understand all the intersections between the efforts people are going about. I think now you can see that happening. Maybe the fruits are going to come
Yeah.
for this too,
Yeah.
for these things happening this year.
Yeah. Great. Yeah.
Is there some sort of, for this June, I'm sorry to hog this, but for this June 18th, is there any kind of organizing committee that, you know, that we should make sure that
Yeah.
the right organizations are?
Right. Yeah. So there's a small one. It's just sort of grown organically. So right now it's WILPF. Alicia's on it. Peace Action New York State. Peace and Planet. United for Peace and Justice. PAX from the Netherlands. Hibakusha Stories, which is an atomic bomb survivors education group here in New York. And WILPF. Who else is on it? Is that it right now?
And then maybe Judith is going to bring some.
Oh, right, Judith LeBlanc. Yeah, so and we're reaching out to others as well. Right now it's just small. We've just had a few calls. We've set up a website. The address is womenbanthebomb.org.
Great.
There's basically no information on it right now, but that's it's got a nice picture. So that's where we're at so far. So But yeah, we're definitely looking for help. So maybe I'll let you and Alicia talk about that too. About how
You
to
look at the
tutor.
other groups that came for all these other things and get grannies and whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And we want to connect up to the people also that organized the Women's March on Washington. Obviously, they managed to mobilize a lot of people, so we want to figure out how they did that and who they're talking to. Yeah.
It's the hack that did it.
Yeah.
You had said the media didn't pick up
Mhm.
the October 27th resolution.
Mhm.
And I always put a damper on things, but the media here are censored.
Mm.
That's why we have alternative media.
Yeah.
And what we need to do is promote and build up as alternative media, independent media as much as possible, because the corporate commercial media are completely co-opted by the oil companies, the pharmaceutical companies, and the whole complex.
Yeah.
So that goes without saying, I
Yeah.
guess, but for the record.
Yeah.
Then the other thing I'm wondering is, you talked a little bit about the way forward, kind of bringing the other groups in after the June and July segment. If they finish the treaty negotiations, then there'll probably be, a circle, as you said, drawn around the nuclear powers, and they'll be forced to kind of, admit that they're outsiders or rogues, to some extent. I guess the idea is to try and, I don't know, after that, to get the public in these states to put so much pressure on their own governments. So,
Yeah.
I mean, we really are going to need alternative media for that, because
Absolutely.
that's the mainstream media are going to be taking
Yeah.
the side of the nuclear powers.
Yeah, yeah. That's for sure. And yeah, we're going to need people in countries that sign on to the treaty to be making sure that their governments are putting the appropriate pressure on. Because of course, what it's going to come down to is non-nuclear armed states are going to have to do some work. Part of that is when they're having bilateral meetings with the nuclear armed states, they're bringing this up, they're making it uncomfortable, they're causing a fuss about it. It's going to mean looking at financial investments, and so that's both something for the public to look at and for their governments to look at. We've already started doing divestment work in terms of nuclear weapons, which has been going really well. PAX, this group in the Netherlands, for the last few years has done a global report, Don't Bank on the Bomb, and looking at what banks have funds invested in nuclear weapon producing companies, and what companies those are and where they're based, etc. Most of the companies, of course, are in the United States. But the banks that invest in them are global. So that's something that people can do as a local action, is call up your bank, ask if it is investing in any of these companies. And this report is a great tool for that, because it shows you what banks are investing in which companies. And even moving your money away from banks that continue to invest in a nuclear weapon production. But then also at the governmental level, we've looked at states that have, say, pension plans, government pension plans that have ethical investments as well. And one of the things that we found interesting is some of these plans, for example, in Australia, the Future Fund, they have divested from cluster munition and landmine producing companies because those weapons are outlawed. And when we've called them to ask why don't they divest from nuclear weapons, they say because they're not illegal. So whenever anybody says nuclear weapons are, we don't need this prohibition treaty, we just need to go for an elimination treaty, this is a clear demonstration of exactly why you need the legal prohibition, because in the public consciousness, they aren't illegal the same way that other weapons are. And it's not that the landmine or cluster munition treaties are universal. They don't have 100% support. The United States has not ratified either of them. But yet, in the public mind, these are illegal weapons. And public companies or public entities see it that way and respond to the public as if they're illegal weapons. So That's sort of a side note onto your question. But yeah, there's going to need to be a lot of awareness about this, and I do agree that independent media is imperative.
But then the next step would at some point be the dismantling treaty?
Yeah. Yeah, so, there's lots of ways that could go. It could be a separate treaty that the nuclear armed states negotiate amongst themselves. It could be that there's a process for them to join on to the ban treaty later and negotiate with the states parties to the ban treaty a plan to eliminate. So there's a few ways that could go. We don't really mind how it goes as long as it goes. But yeah, the idea is to compel them to that point.
Okay, and you said it's is Reaching Critical Will's website is rcw.org?
Reachingcriticalwill.org.
Okay, and you guys will have more
Yes.
information about events and
Absolutely,
so on.
yeah.
Okay, so we'll keep on top of that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good. Yes.
Most people that I relate to are not part of the peace movement. Short of saying that we better eliminate nukes or the whole world can be blown up, how do I present the opportunity to do away with nuclear weapons in a more positive light?
Well, I think one of the most compelling things right now for people might be economics. The government has promised $1 trillion into the nuclear weapon modernization program at the same time as Social Security's cut, healthcare is a mess, etc. So it could be that the economic argument might resonate with people. That if the governments that possess them say that they're not ever to be used. So why are we investing trillions and trillions of dollars into a weapon that we can't use? What's interesting, and this is not an argument that that WILPF makes or that ICANN would necessarily make, but what is interesting is we've had from some military sectors in the US and the UK say that they don't want nuclear weapons. They don't think that their budget should go towards nuclear weapons because they're not weapons that they can use. They would like more money to be going towards weapons they can use in the battlefield, more equipment or soldiers, etc. And so nuclear weapons for them are a political weapon. We've heard military people in the UK describe them as political weapons and demand that the Department of Foreign Affairs pay for them rather than the Department of Defense. In the United States, it's under the Department of Energy. So I think that there's a lot of economic arguments against them that would probably be useful for people beyond the sort of fear and destruction of death, which should be a pretty compelling argument as well, I think. Yeah.
Can you explain of the role of fuel rods in nuclear weapons? Because I know the Japanese are opposed to nuclear power, nuclear weapons, everything should be abolished.
Right.
And I've heard that the fuel rods that are used in nuclear plants are used for the weapon system. Is that correct?
No, that's not exactly correct. But so in Japan, they have a big reprocessing industry. And so when you're reprocessing nuclear fuel, that material could be used in a nuclear weapon if it's reprocessed to a certain degree. Same with uranium as well. If you process it to a certain point, then it can be used in a nuclear weapon as opposed to just a nuclear power plant. So it's more about the materials than about the equipment itself. Yeah. So if you are a nuclear power producing country and you're enriching uranium or reprocessing to plutonium, then those materials could, in theory, be used in a nuclear bomb. But you'd also need a whole other nuclear weapon development program to make that happen. Yeah, there was someone over here. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So, so I wanted to ask a related question. So, as you see it, would this treaty allow states that have nuclear energy to continue to import uranium ore and enrich it, et cetera, for nuclear energy, nuclear power plants.
Yes, this treaty won't affect nuclear power. WILPF, as an organization, is opposed to nuclear power and supports renewables. But this treaty is only going to address the nuclear weapon aspect of the problem. Yeah. And, yep.
Too much emphasis is placed on legality, and far too many people who are involved in the maybe negotiations or the diplomatic action are legally trained. And the assumption I assume is, as I see it, is that laws are legitimate almost by definition. But this disregards the fact that many of the laws that they themselves study are, let's say, the Roman laws or Justinian Code or Napoleonic Code, or laws basically established by people who wage major wars, gain empires or defeat enemies, and then laws are written, etc. Ultimately, despite all this, nobody managed to conquer the world, obviously, so there is no global law. And nation states themselves are, in the eyes of some people, including me, criminal organizations. So when you tailor policies based on the assumption that they will continue, the climate that they inherited, the climate within which they developed, will also continue, which is basically a system of anarchy. Whatever laws we can have is not going to provide enough security for us. And so one criticism would be to this legalistic thinking. Another one is a human-centered approach to security. All of what we discussed so far relates to a technology, but basically a human-made technology. And human beings, their intents, their institutions, etc. We're just one species out of 30 million plus on this planet, and the entire planet is not a safe planet. There are natural forces that we can't control, that we can't even properly protect ourselves from. Many of those natural disasters actually ended up preparing our dominance on this planet. We were not originally a dominant species, obviously. So maybe it's more difficult to think of alternatives that would do away with the nation states and the anarchy, obviously. Maybe it's too much homework for some people, but without that, I assume that we can have yet another setback to the anti-war movement through a legal agreement that would mean very little. For instance, the test ban treaty of the 60s, as I see it, dealt a serious blow to the anti-war movement. After that, a lot of people said, oh, okay, they conceded that, maybe they're not all irrational, okay, fine, let's go home. Likewise, biological and chemical weapons were banned. Is the world safe? And another way of approaching this is, you can have an armed conflict in which you can say both sides lose, or you can have a conflict or no conflict, but one side wins over another. Let's say between Bangladesh and India. They never go to wars, but whenever there is too much water, India dumps water into Bangladesh. When there is too little water, they keep it in their dams. And Bangladesh suffers. And what can they do? I mean, there are many sources of conflict where there may not actually be a physical struggle, etc., but one side continuously loses. Is that peace? Is that our understanding of peace? I mean, you can have a household where the husband gets away with murder and nobody rises up against the husband or the father. So there's no war, there's no conflict maybe, but well, everybody else loses. So likewise, when we think of nation states and empires and large countries continuing their existence, this is not necessarily a gain for most of humankind. It's not a win. And if you think of nation states, there are fewer than 200 nation states. There are thousands of ethnic groups that are dying to be nation states for whatever reason, I don't know. So their own national government is their enemy, their oppressor, or they overtax them or give them too few services, etc. So we can't be myopic about just nuclear weapons, I'm afraid.
No, and I wouldn't say that that WILPF or Peace Action or any group that I really know working on this issue is myopic. I think that I tend to resist the argument or approach that we need to fix everything at once in order to be successful. So taking on the nation state system as the way that we've organized ourselves globally, that's a project. Taking on violent technologies that humans have produced, that's a project. Taking on the myriad of human rights violations happening around the world, that's a project. All of these things, I think, are important to the overall project of taking us towards a type of society or community as humans that we want to live in, however that's organized, and whether that's organized as a global solidarity based in human security with a completely different set of arrangements for how we're interacting with each other. That might be. But I don't think that we cannot tackle something like nuclear weapons until we've sorted out all those other problems. I think it's all part of the same project. And I think this is a piece of the puzzle. I think that it has implications that go well beyond nuclear weapons as its own technology. I think we're seeing this from the way that we're trying to develop this particular treaty on nuclear weapons. We're building on a body of law, but also social understandings of violent technologies that have built up over time through the prohibitions of other weapons like biological and chemical weapons. Is the world safe because we outlawed them? No, of course not. There's still many other problems in the world that need to be fixed. But outlawing biological and chemical weapons has provided us with a platform to outlaw nuclear weapons. Same with the cluster munitions, same with landmines. These are all part of humanitarian disarmament geared towards achieving human security, upholding human rights. Does it solve all problems? No, of course not. It's a piece of the puzzle. And I think that understanding its place in the trajectory of the broader social justice movements that we're a part of and the goals that we have to improve ourselves as a species in which we don't just communicate with each other through violence, I think it's all important work. So whatever our particular priorities are, whatever opportunities happen to be open, and this moment, this is the opportunity that's open to us in terms of weapons technologies. So we're trying to seize that whilst putting it into its broader context of peace and justice, I would say. Yes.
Quick question. We're going to have to wrap up after this question.
Okay. Donald Trump has accused Obama of shortchanging the military. Yet I believe you said that the Obama administration dedicated $1 trillion to nuclear weapon systems alone.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me in what areas this money was spent?
It hasn't been spent yet.
Yes.
It hasn't been
It's a
spent.
commitment,
What do you think
30
of
years.
going on the street
Oh,
every
the
year?
next 30 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But Obama has not shortchanged the military in any regard.
It's bigger than ever.
Yeah, it's bigger than ever, exactly.
Right. Anyway, let's thank Ray Acheson for coming, taking the time to talk.